Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The UN has finally admitted it was involved in the outbreak of cholera in Haiti 6 years ago that killed nearly 10,000 people. Researchers say the disease, which came just months after a devastating earthquake, was introduced to Haiti's biggest river by inadequately treated sewage from a base of UN peacekeepers from Nepal. But the United Nations has denied responsibility for years and insists it has diplomatic immunity from prosecution. So far, 800,000 have fallen ill from the waterborne disease since 2010, and it's still killing 37 people a month. Our correspondent Nick Bryant reports from New York.
Haiti had been free of cholera for 100 years, but the outbreak that's ripped through the Caribbean country since 2010 has killed some 10,000 people and infected 800,000 more, many of them young children. Scientific studies have repeatedly indicated the disease was brought to the country by UN peacekeepers from Nepal, whose human waste contaminated local water supplies. But despite the overwhelming weight of evidence, the UN has refused to acknowledge any involvement. Now, finally, that's changed.
In partnership with the Haitian government, the UN's been heavily engaged in cholera eradication since the 2010 outbreak. But over the past year, the UN has become convinced that it needs to do much more regarding its own involvement in the initial outbreak and the suffering of those affected by cholera.
The change of heart at UN headquarters follows a confidential report that found that cholera would not have broken out but for the actions of the United Nations. The report also called its response morally unconscionable, legally indefensible, and politically self-defeating. Last night, a court in New York rejected a compensation claim brought by Haitian victims, upholding the UN's long-held position that it enjoys diplomatic immunity. So while the organisation has acknowledged its involvement in the outbreak, it still refuses to accept any legal responsibility. For those on the ground in Haiti still battling this disease, that's not good enough.
This has a huge impact on the Haitian people. It's something that is not indigenous to them. This is not a disease that they had seen before. It is a new threat to their livelihoods, a new threat to their health, and a new threat to their economic development as a country. And the UN is responsible for that. They need to take action.
The United Nations has worked to eradicate the disease in Haiti and promised new action. But to many, its refusal to pay compensation is morally offensive, showing heartlessness in a time of cholera. Nick Bryant, BBC News, New York.
Now, more than 650 children have been forced into joining government and rebel forces in South Sudan since January. In the past 2.5 years, around 16,000 children have been recruited by militias and armed forces. But a recent renewal of fighting between rival forces is concerning the international community, who fear it'll mean a dramatic upsurge in child soldiers. I've been speaking to the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Justin Forsyth, who's just left the capital of South Sudan, Juba. We spoke via the internet from Nairobi, and I put it to him that his figures are quite astonishing.
Really astonishing and shocking. And in the last few months, another 600 plus have been recruited. And some of these young boys are forced to kill people. They're forced to torture them. They're forced to rape. They then become the most vicious because they're controlled completely by the adults, and they're easily manipulated by the generals and the officers in these armed groups.
So given that degree of indoctrination, and given that that is the most attractive thing about them, what can you do to counter those circumstances?
We need to persuade the armed groups, the government, but also the opposition, that this is unacceptable. But the latest spate of violence that broke out a month ago in Juba, the capital, has set everything back in South Sudan. South Sudan is on the abyss of a crisis. All the progress that was being made is being undermined. And, you know, some people already think it's in free fall. I think there's still a chance for the government and the opposition to pull back.
You work for UNICEF, but what integrity does the UN per se have in southern Sudan when last month, on the 11th of July, an attack by South Sudanese forces on the Terrain Hotel in Juba, just a mile from a UN compound, basically when it went ahead without anyone intervening. One person was killed, several people, including foreign aid workers, were raped. There were repeated calls to the UN compound to intervene. They did absolutely nothing. This doesn't exactly inspire you with confidence for the UN's ability to intervene by action or by words in that part of the world.
I think we were all shocked, and the humanitarian community in Juba are really shocked by this, all of the UNICEF, but all the NGO workers, by what happened in those terrible rapes. The rise of rape as a part of this conflict has really escalated, and the armed groups, the government and the opposition, need to take responsibility for this. I met with very senior ministers in the South Sudanese government and made a very forcible complaint about attacks on aid workers, on the need to protect aid workers, to allow us access to these remote areas in South Sudan, not just the capital, but in even worse areas beyond the capital, but also rape against women and girls right across South Sudan is on the rise. And we've got to really stand up for the rights of women and girls and humanitarian workers. This is completely unacceptable.
All week long, we on Channel 4 News have been dealing with the plight of children in the city of Aleppo in Syria. I know that's not South Sudan. As someone who is very senior in UNICEF, what is your reaction to this? What can be done about this? Because it seems as if the rest of the world has just been relegated to ringside observer in this appalling butchery.
I don't think I've ever seen something as bad as Aleppo. Aleppo feels like reading the history of Stalingrad during the Second World War, a city besieged, aid workers crawling through, Syrian aid workers actually, crawling through the rubble to rescue people, these white helmets, bringing aid in, humanitarian workers under fire, doctors being shot at, children being scarred. It's horrific. And it's completely unacceptable in 2016 that this is happening in our world. And the international community has to be outraged. But we also have to be honest. This won't stop unless there's an end to this war. So we need to redouble the diplomatic efforts, not just the humanitarian efforts, to bring an end to this war.
Justin Forsyth of UNICEF speaking to me earlier. Thank you.
For almost 3 years, South Sudan, the world's youngest country, has been involved in a bloody and complex multi-ethnic civil war. It's between rival factions loyal to President Salva Kiir from the Dinka ethnic group and Riek Machar, who is ethnic Nuer. Right now, a tentative ceasefire is in place. But in June, fighting broke out in the capital, Juba. On July the 11th, the compound at Hotel Tehran, which housed teams of international staff from several organisations, many of them aid workers, was overrun by South Sudanese troops fresh from winning a battle with opposition forces. Their rampage saw one Nuer journalist murdered, women raped and gang-raped, dozens of staff assaulted and the whole compound looted. A United Nations base was just up the road, less than 1 mile away, and the UN is now being accused of not responding properly to the attack. This is the story of that day, told to Newsnight by 5 of the people who were there. 2 Americans, a Philippine aid worker called Gian Libot, and 2 other Westerners. To protect their identities, we have asked actors to read out their words, and I really must warn you that this film contains deeply distressing testimony of sexual violence.
Monday morning was stressful, but it wasn't out of the ordinary anymore.
So we were actually feeling pretty good until someone said that there had been a call from someone, I don't remember who, but they said that the soldiers had breached the front gate and were coming into the compound. So I sent my first message to the UN to say that our gate had been breached, and that was one of many messages that I sent before my phone was taken.
We heard people breaking into the compound. They were shooting and stealing things. About an hour later, they figured out where we were, and they methodically tried to break in the door.
So I was hiding underneath the bed at first sign of contact with the soldiers. And the first thing they did was shout, you know, where is the money? Where is the laptop? Where is the phone?
They kept asking people, what is your nationality? Where are you from? They were looking for Americans.
John was one of our local colleagues, and He sought refuge with us because he thought he'd be safer with his international colleagues.
When the soldiers first entered the building, they saw John run from one of the apartment rooms, and they grabbed him and they threw him to the ground, and they started beating him with rifle butts.
And while this was happening, a few of the soldiers came from behind and were just shouting, and one of the distinct words that came out was a word, "Noir," and this sort of acted like a trigger for the soldier holding a gun to John. 2 shots were fired and he immediately fell to the ground.
It was clear that the situation had really escalated. Successive waves of soldiers came into the room and they separated the men and the women. I was trapped in a room and repeatedly raped. Sometimes by one person, sometimes with many people in the room. Until I was taken out of that room and I was put in another room and it started all over again.
I went to hide inside a bathroom with another 11 people. Everyone was trying to write messages on Facebook, WhatsApp. We were asking for help.
One of the soldiers looked me right in the eye. He asked me where I was from, and I said I was American, and he started aggressively patting me down.
The first soldier was very clear. He put a gun to my head and he said, "If you don't have sex with me, then every soldier in the room will have sex with you and then we'll shoot you." So he made it very clear that there really wasn't another option.
And he was telling me to open your legs, open your legs. And I wasn't really cooperating. So then he pulled my pants off completely and took both my shoes off, threw them on the floor, and then he raped me. And it didn't last very long. I would say maybe a minute.
Some of the soldiers were aggressive and they kept shouting, "Kawaja, Kawaja," the white lady, and they tried to get the others involved, tried to encourage them. Some of the soldiers wanted to sit down and make small talk like we were on some sort of date. It was completely surreal. One of them, he wasn't one of the ones who raped me, he said, "Are you sad?" And I said, "Well, yes, I'm upset." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Your soldiers raped me and I'm upset because they shouldn't do that." And he said, "You can't be upset. There's no need to be upset because this is the work of God and not the work of man. And you don't need to be upset." And then he walked off.
It was about 7 o'clock, 7:30, later day, and we were extracted by someone in uniform.
We actually got taken to the National Security Building, and there were again many men in uniforms standing around. They were all pretending they didn't know what had happened to us. "Oh, you're okay. You're okay here. Don't be scared." And at that point, one of my colleagues was saying, "I don't think you understand what we have just been through. One of us has been shot. The women have been raped. How can you tell us to relax?" And this man said, "I'm sorry for the inconvenience this has caused you."
I went out and tried to see if there was anybody, but I couldn't see anybody, and these soldiers saw me and ordered me to go to this apartment, and with his gun he touched me everywhere. It was violent and it was so scary. He ordered me to take my pants off, and I saw my friend being raped. And he ordered me to go there, and I had to wait in front of this girl. Then they went away, and it was this long and terrible and horrific night waiting for help, waiting for someone to come.
Generally, the compound has security lighting, but there was nothing, and it was just actually pitch black. There was rubble everywhere because they had upended everything in the apartment block, so I kept creeping out of my hiding place ever so often to just listen and see if it was safe. I wanted to get out of there and find a time when I could run to the bush and hide. We could see John's body was still on the ground, and we covered it with a sheet out of respect.
It was incredible. The first moment I understood that morning has arrived. The birds were singing. Once I heard the birds, I said to my friend, "The birds are singing, morning has arrived." And we cried.
We survive. We're whisked out of the country and given treatment straight away. We have access to counselling. We are taken back to our homes that are in relatively stable parts of the world, and we're looked after, you know. It's a horrific experience and a traumatic thing to recover from, but that's our experience. For the women of South Sudan, that experience of rape, much more violent way and much more often than we ever would. But they didn't get the chance to leave.
Actors there reading the real testimony of those who were attacked. The UN has been criticised for not acting quickly enough to come to the aid of those in the Hotel Tehran. And today we asked to speak to someone from the organisation, but no one was available. This week, a statement from the UN Secretary-General's office said that, due to the gravity of these incidents, Ban Ki-moon has decided, and I quote, to launch an independent special investigation to determine the circumstances surrounding these incidents and to evaluate the mission's overall response.